How does the assimilation of Hmong Americans affect relationships with white people? I ask this question because when looking at major texts, it seems that there are few instances, if any, of positive relationships between Hmong and white Americans. Could this be due to assimilation here in America? And if so, how and why does that affect relations with white individuals? To start, let's look at an article from Mi Zhang titled Assimilation of the Hmong in the United States. In this research article, Zhang investigates the, quote, concern about the inevitable acculturation and assimilation of immigrant groups that cause cultural conflicts and acculturation stress which can lead to the death of one's original or ancestral culture, end quote. Zhang predicts in this article that, quote, future generations of Hmong in America will lose their cultural identity, end quote, over time because of the major influences of mainstream culture in America. The article takes a look at old and new Hmong generations to see if they still feel connected to their heritage or if they've lost that connection and have assimilated, and examines if knowledge of Hmong language, culture, and traditions have been passed down to younger generations. In her findings, Zhang reveals that there's a significant decline of Hmong identity within the community. To quote Mi Zhang, the Hmong population stands at 350,000. Only 0.12% of the total people living in the United States, making the minority cultural group especially vulnerable to acculturation and assimilation, end quote, which is exactly what Zhang found in her research. Ever since Hmong immigrants started arriving in America roughly 50 years ago, they have been subjected to assimilation, which has shown over time a loss of Hmong identity and disconnect to their culture. I think this research article is a great foundational blueprint in understanding assimilation, specifically towards Hmong individuals, and will be a great place to start when looking at other items. So what about representation of Hmong in pop culture? Well, in 2008, the movie Gran Torino, directed by Clint Eastwood, was released. Gran Torino is one of, if not the biggest depictions of Hmong identities in mainstream America. A New York Times film critic calls it hope for a racist and maybe a country. The critic goes on to say, quote, few Americans make movies about this country anymore, end quote. Throughout this article, the New York Times critic is relatively positive towards the film and feels like it's a poignant send-off for Clint Eastwood's career and legacy, even though he did end up making and starring in more movies after Gran Torino. Wait, didn't I say the movie is one of the biggest depictions of Hmong Americans in film? Well, in the article, it sure sounds like the movie is all about Clint Eastwood's character. In fact, the film critic doesn't even bring up Hmong representation until halfway through the article, and Hmong is only said 3 times in the review, whereas Clint Eastwood's name is brought up over a dozen times throughout the review. Interesting. The critic acknowledges that Eastwood's character is a bigot, but never explicitly says that he's racist throughout the film. In fact, the reviewer feels quite dismissive toward the bigotry and even calls it funny and comical, but I don't think in an ironic sense. The critic says things like, Mr. Eastwood's loose at times, very funny performance in the early part of the film is one of its great pleasures. And the film moves from comedy into drama and then tragedy and then into something completely unexpected. I think because Eastwood's character has some sort of thematic arc, it excuses his funny bigotry in the first half of the movie. This is where I started my essential question. Why do people like this movie? Well, it's because of acculturation. The film tries to have both parties, Clint Eastwood's character, Walt, and his neighbors who are Hmong, assimilate. This brings me to my main claim. Hmong Americans have to assimilate to fit in with white Americans in order to feel empowered. But even then, that's not enough because it is still disempowerment because Hmong have to make all the efforts while the dominant party does not. So let's look at the film Gran Torino. Walt never takes the initiative to talk to his newly moved-in neighbors. Instead, it's Sue that starts conversations and convinces him to come over to the house. Sue has to assimilate in order to get on Walt's side. But the movie plays it off like Walt is learning about their culture and Sue is learning about his. It presents blatant racism and some sort of culture clash. Once they get over their cultural differences, then Walt will start to understand. But this is extremely harmful writing and instead promotes the perpetual foreigner. There are instances where Walt pronounces Hmong wrong and Sue corrects him.
You shouldn't be hanging out with them. You should be hanging out with your own people, the other Hmongs.
You mean Hmong?
Yeah.
Hmong, not Hmong.
Whatever.
Walt not only has the inability to change, but he also has the inability to listen. This inability to not listen to Hmong voices creates this expectation that Hmong Americans have to step up, that Hmong Americans have to assimilate in order to remotely feel heard and respected. Sue is extremely patient to work with Walt, whereas Walt is not open to change. In fact, I would argue he really does not change at all, and everyone else around him does the heavy lifting to assimilate and to get on his good side. Walt tries some of the food made by the Hmong family and helps out Tao, but even then, him helping out Tao is just having him assimilate into the societal standards.
See, now go out, come back and talk to him, and it ain't rocket science, for Christ's sake.
Yeah, but I don't have a job, a car, or a girlfriend.
Jesus, I should have blown his head off when I had the chance.
Yeah, maybe so. Now, okay, I want you to turn around and go outside and come back and don't talk about having no job, no car, no girlfriend, no future, no dick, okay? Just turn around and go.
Excuse me, sir. I need a haircut, if you ain't too busy. You old Italian son of a bitch prick barber. Boy, does my ass hurt from all the guys in my construction job.
Taking a look at another text in the Radiolab podcast near the end of the interview with Ang Yang and Clea Yang, Robert persists that Ang never saw yellow rain fall from the sky, so he does not know if it's chemicals or just bee feces.
Leaves could kill trees.
But he himself is not clear whether it's the bee stuff or whether it's other stuff, because there was so much stuff coming down from the sky.
戰爭嘛，因為空水已經柏林的那些人已別人講啦，但是伊朗別學聽。
กูชิเป้าให้เดียวว่านั่งนายกสุนเจอจอมปัญหาจ้อ
You know that there were chemicals being used against the Hmong in the mountains of Laos. Whether this is the chemicals from the bombs or yellow rain, chemicals were being used. It feels to him like this is a semantic debate, and it feels like there's a sad lack of justice. That the word of a man who survived this thing must be pitted against a professor from Harvard who's read these accounts.
But as far as I can tell, your uncle didn't see the bee pollen fall. Your uncle didn't see a plane. All of this is hearsay.
This once again disempowers Hmong stories and identities. Ang and Clea Yang were given a platform by this podcast, but that platform was stripped away from them when the interviewers derailed the conversation and tried to look at the issue in an objective lens. All Ang Yang wanted was for a journalist company to hear what he had to say, but instead was disempowered on the recording. The interviewers on the podcast are unable to listen to Hmong perspectives because they aren't willing to change. Once again, there's this expectation for Hmong individuals to do the heavy lifting and to assimilate, to fit in to some sort of status quo. And when they don't, there's tension, there's friction. The podcast does not even bring up Ang and Clea Yang's credentials and refers to Ang as Hmong guy. Having Clea Yang on the podcast to interpret for Ang Yang and have him tell his story is empowering. But they were shut down mainly by Robert and were not heard. Even if Ang spoke in English and assimilated, that probably would still not be enough for the interviewers to listen to him because they already had their minds made up. Finally, in The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, the Lee family is disempowered by MCMC because the Lee family didn't assimilate, thus having a negative experience with the white doctors. Because the Lee family didn't assimilate to a superior institution, they ended up having Leah stripped away from them. Quote, all he, Neil, wanted was to get Leah out of her hands and into the stewardship of someone who would administrate her medications exactly as he prescribed them. End quote. The Lee family had other ways of taking care of Leah, but the American doctors did not give them the chance to hear out their story. Once again, not listening because they hadn't assimilated. Neil and Peggy had a way of doing things and were not going to change anything for a patient. They saw things through an objective lens in what was constituted as scientific. Quote, but with a minor, the state has the right, indeed the obligation, to force the patient to comply with a life-saving treatment, even if it's forbidden by the family's religion. End quote. The dominant party, in this case the state, has the authority to strip away any sort of autonomy or empowerment that the Lee family might have had. And this is mainly because they did not assimilate to the standards within the state. It seems that an argument can be made that when Hmong individuals don't assimilate, they have a harder time interacting with white people. And when they do, it's not enough for the superior side. In Gran Torino, Sue is a really compelling and strong character who is persistent in getting to know Walt. However, later, her character is completely thrown away and the rest of the movie focuses on Walt and Tao's relationship. But Tao is mainly used as someone to be turned into Walt. Tao ends up becoming Walt and assimilating in order for there to be some sort of connection between the two, but it's not really a positive relationship though. In the Radiolab podcast, the interviewers were not willing to hear a different perspective. They may have invited Clea and Yang on the podcast, but they already felt they had a sense of the story and were not interested in hearing about a victim's perspective. And finally, in The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, the Lee family did not assimilate, causing Neil to call Child Protective Services for Leah. So it mainly looks like we went over negative portrayals of Hmong and white Americans in text. And that's because there really isn't much out there from what I can find, at least not yet. Maybe for now, real Hmong stories need to be told by Hmong writers before any sort of positive relationship between white and Hmong Americans can be displayed in texts.